freedom of the open skies, the miracle of soaring birds had long challenged humankind to break the bonds of Earth. And enterprising young flyers would soon accept the challenge and be lured to the north in their flimsy aircraft. A northern pilot today might be found at the controls of a CL-215 water bomber. And representative of the North, even in the name, Canada's own Snowbirds aerobatic team inspired many to dare the dream of flight. For many northern residents, the sound of float planes on a nearby lake or river was a sign of spring. And so it is in Sault Ste. Marie. The beautiful mystery of flight has always inspired dreams. And coupled with an historic aviation setting, restored aircraft, and your own imagination, dreams can be lived. One Sault Ste. Marie child was inspired by the sounds of those bush planes on the river, and she dared to dream. Canada's first woman astronaut and Sault Ste. Marie's own Dr. Roberta Bondar has soared to heights where even eagles do not fly. Relive those dreams here on Earth. The Canadian Bushplane Heritage Centre, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. The Canadian Bushplane Heritage Centre, where dedicated staff and volunteers work to preserve and bring alive the historic contributions made to the development of Canada by that uniquely Canadian phenomenon, the bushplane. A full-size replica of the Silver Dart is hoisted aloft for easier viewing. This was the first heavier-than-air powered machine to fly in Canada. J.A.D. McCurdy flew the Silver Dart biplane off the ice at Bedeque, Nova Scotia, February 23, 1909. It was the airplane, the bushplane, that would take Canadians beyond the last reaches of the roads and the railways. Pilots flew without weather reports, radio communications, or maps. They connected remote settlements to the outside world, and in addition to bringing in people and supplies, they flew mercy flights and took on search and rescue missions. Many of the bush pilots would become folk heroes to the small, isolated settlements that they serviced. The airplane was providing access to uncharted lands and isolated areas well beyond the reaches of the roads and the railways. Aircraft proved invaluable in aerial timber surveys, mapping, and in detecting threatening forest fires. After World War I, you could purchase a surplus Curtiss Canuck trainer like this for about $200. The Jenny was the first aircraft that afforded many young would-be pilots the opportunity to fly. And many of them did. Barnstormers trying to make a few dollars were showing up across the country. Geordie Doan, an aircraft mechanic from Sault Ste. Marie, was also a wing walker. One of Daredevil Doan's stunts included climbing from one airplane to another, in flight, and then parachuting to the ground. But in 1922, in attempting one of the few parachute jumps from an airplane in Canada, Geordie got all tangled up. When he couldn't get loose, and the airplane was in danger of stalling and crashing, the pilot headed out over Lake Ontario. Just above the water, Geordie cut himself free and hit the water, skipping like a stone. Daredevil Doan survived and joined the Ontario Provincial Air Service to work at the Sault Ste. Marie Aerodrome. For many years, Sault Ste. Marie would be an important crossroads in Canadian aviation. The decision to base the OPAS at Sault Ste. Marie in 1924 was made because of its central location and the fact that the fast-flowing St. Mary's River was ice-free early in the spring. In 1922, one of the worst forest fires in Ontario's history, the Haileybury Fire, burned over 518,000 hectares, or 1.25 million acres, and took 44 lives. The Ontario government, realizing the valuable role of aircraft in the detection and suppression of forest fires, formed the Provincial Air Service in 1924. Roy Maxwell, an experienced bush pilot, was its first director. He immediately set about acquiring a fleet of lumbering Curtiss HS-2Ls, or H-boats, ex-U.S. Navy coastal patrol aircraft left over from World War I. Maxwell recruited a team of pilots and air engineers, many of them following him from Laurentide Aviation. Their arrival in Sault Ste. Marie signaled the eventual demise of hundreds of fire rangers who patrolled the north by canoe or railway handcars looking for fires. The listed airspeed of the H-boat was 91 miles an hour, but pilots swore that they took off at 60 miles an hour, flew at 60, and landed at 60. Forced landings were routine. That big 12-cylinder Liberty engine would sputter and die all too frequently. And as summer progressed, they became a little waterlogged and very heavy. And if they didn't have a good wind, sometimes they couldn't get off the water. In 1925, 2 loaning air yachts were added to the Air Service fleet. Passengers could sit inside in comfort. Unfortunately, both crashed shortly afterwards. But over the years, as the Air Service's roles developed and increased, they acquired aircraft better suited to meet the challenges of bush flying. The reliable Vickers Vedette was a big improvement over the H-boats and was in service until 1944. De Havilland engineers in England claimed that the Gypsy Moth could not be used as a floatplane. The Ontario Provincial Air Service engineers and pilots proved them wrong. The Gypsy Moth on floats could take off and climb like a homesick angel. The Giant Moth, with cabin seating for 8, was at the time the pride of the fleet. It was adapted from spare parts from earlier de Havilland aircraft and was designed in a week. Aircraft crisscrossing the Northland reported many forest fires. To support the detection effort, the government built more than 200 fire towers in strategic locations. Spotting smoke on the horizon, several towers were able to pinpoint the location using triangulation on a map. The towerman would then call in the fire and crews would be dispatched. The easily recognizable gull-winged Stinson Reliant might be used to fly fire crews and equipment into action. The Buell, 4 of which were built at Sault Ste. Marie, wasn't a great bushplane. It was underpowered, but even with a larger engine, it was still a bull to fly. And here are the remains of one of them, extracted from the bush where it crashed years ago, heading back home to the Bushplane Heritage Center for display. And no Bushplane Museum would be complete without a true northern hero, the Nordine Norseman. The first all-Canadian designed and built aircraft, the Nordine Norseman was first tested in Montreal in 1935. Capable of seating 8, or hauling large amounts of cargo, on floats it was called the first real bushplane. and a few can still be found working in the northern bush. It also served both the Canadian and American military for years. In fact, the prototype Norseman, CF-AYO, was featured in Captains of the Clouds, a Warner Brothers wartime film starring Jimmy Cagney, which was filmed mostly in Ontario. These remains of AYO were retrieved from Algonquin Park, where it crashed in 1953 with the loss of 3 lives. Aircraft like the Norseman served their owners well and performed admirably under demanding conditions. But aircraft design engineers, meeting the changing needs of bush operators, were developing new and better machines. In 1947, one of the most promising aircraft being developed was the Fairchild Husky. It was suited to the bush with its high tail and rear clamshell cargo doors, through which you could load a 16-foot canoe. But the Husky was underpowered compared to its competitor, the Beaver. Only 12 Huskies were ever built. Like the Norseman, the OPAS Stinsons were sold off to private operators in 1949 and 50 to make way for the de Havilland Beavers. Starting in 1948, the Air Service purchased more than 40 de Havilland Beavers. "40 years later, the Beaver would be the recipient of an engineering design award attesting to its durability and longevity. OBS, the first Beaver off the production line after the prototype, is proudly on display at the center. And nearby, taking its rightful place on the floor of the hangar, is its larger cousin, the hard-working de Havilland Otter. Since 1924, this hangar was always a hub of activity, and because of the resourceful personnel, a place of ideas, innovation, and change. A number of shops were created to repair aircraft and keep them floating and flying, but which also had the capacity to manufacture an aircraft. Up to 50 aircraft could be stored and serviced here during the long winter months. The unsung heroes were the air engineers who kept the planes in the air or salvaged a downed aircraft, returning it to airworthy status. It takes ingenuity to move a heavy engine or a bulky wing into place and to make it functional. And at spring breakup, the familiar sound of engines being run up outdoors meant the flock of yellowbirds would soon be taking off for far-flung water bases scattered across Ontario's Northland. Waterbombing tests started in the mid-1940s. First, Air Service staff dropped bags of water through the rear camera hatch of the aircraft. That didn't work too well. They developed rollover tanks mounted on top of the floats. This was a good start, and it worked. In 1957, in Sudbury District, Tom Cook, flying the first Otter with rollover tanks, held a mile-long fire front at bay until fire crews were able to get in on the ground and put the fire out. By 1958, all of the Otters and Beavers had the float-mounted roll tanks. New floats with compartments for water and hydraulic bombing doors would improve effectiveness for years to come. The piston Beaver would be replaced by the Turbo Beaver, used widely in support of resource-related projects. On wheels, floats, or skis, the Beaver was and continues to be one of the best single-engine utility aircraft ever built. Sold to private operators, the Beaver and Otter can be found all over the world and are the aircraft of choice of many northern bush flyers. The Otter itself would be replaced by the turbine-engine Twin Otter. Amphibious waterbombing floats for the Twin Otter were developed by OPAS staff in the Sioux. or short takeoff and landing capability of the de Havilland aircraft make them a favorite with pilots operating in tight spaces, whether it's on a wharf in New York City or on a short stretch of barren Arctic tundra. In the early 1970s, the OPAS purchased 6 Grumman trackers from the aircraft carrier La Bonaventure. They were converted to carry fire-retarding liquid, which could be dropped on a fire. The land-based trackers were faster and could carry a heavier payload than existing aircraft. However, float-equipped water bombers could make more frequent drops on a fire by picking up water on nearby lakes and rivers. Canadair's CL-215 water bomber, another Canadian innovation, is the aerial firefighting workhorse in much of Canada. Ontario recently upgraded its fleet by adding the CL-415, a faster, more powerful turbine version of its predecessor. Helicopters and water bombers are the backbone of today's modern firefighting fleet, flying in support of crews of firefighters on the ground. Like familiar aircraft of yesteryear, many pilots and engineers have left their mark. Whether in the service of Ontario or in the employ of aviation elsewhere, many would go on to achieve prominence in Canadian and global aviation circles for their leadership, their exploits, and innovation. For these pioneers, their courage and their imagination took them to new heights. Join us now and let your imagination take you on your personal flight to the world of Canadian bushplane heritage.